Rolling Stones, the greatest rock and roll band of all time. That's what we're going to be talking about today on Mark and Pete Live. I'm joined today by businessman Mark. I'm clergyman Pete. So, Mark, what have you got for us this time? What's all this about the Rolling Stones? What are we talking about them?
Well, the Rolling Stones,
are they
really the greatest rock and roll band of all time? Now, one of the reasons that this is prompted, of course, we've seen the sad news that Charlie Watts, who was the drummer of the Rolling Stones, has sadly died at the age of 80 years of age. Now, that's a good age, but nevertheless, he was seen as one of the greatest rock and roll drummers, but part of a group which we know has evolved over time with some classic hits like I Can Get No Satisfaction, Jumping Jack Flash, Honky Tonk Woman, and many others. But does that mean that they are necessarily, because of the longevity, the greatest of all time? Well, that's what we want to debate. Now, I have a point here, which is, I think in their early days, they were fantastic. I think they rivaled the Beatles at the time, as was often positioned in the media. But what I think is crucial, and this is where we come with the business angle, folks, I think they were very clever commercially. And that's what I want to bring up.
Mm-hmm. Yes, well, the Rolling Stones was popular from, I guess, for quite a long time, weren't they? 60s onwards, I guess.
Indeed.
So you're talking about a band that spans quite a lot of time, and during that time, they did Mark impinge on my consciousness, even though I'm not a fan generally of pop music. But what I noticed is, so coming at this from a Christian worldview point of view, as being the clergyman here, I think that, obviously entertainment's good. It's good that they brought joy to people through their music, but I think that their rather chaotic lifestyle, at least for some of them, maybe all of them to some extent, and at least in the early part of their career, I don't think that was a good thing. I think they were they were part of a whole cultural shift in which taking drugs. Not that they were shooting up on stage, but you know what I mean. They were open about taking drugs, and also certain attitudes to sex, thinking of what was seen as the scandals of Bill Wyman's private life back in the day. He played some sort of stringed instrument in the band, didn't he? You
can tell you're not the expert.
The general attitude, I'm not the expert, folks. The general attitude, I thought was, part of that breakup of traditional values, which I think is a shame. But I don't think they can be blamed for that. But that doesn't mean that they reach greatness to me.
Well, let me give you my view on their artistic achievements.
Yes.
I thought in the early days.
Go ahead.
So the thing that, let's set the scene. 1960s unfold. The Beatles take the world by storm, and what's remarkable is that Decca, the music publisher at the time, had actually turned down the Beatles famously. So they needed something to redeem themselves. And they signed, of course, the Rolling Stones. Now, Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, and others formed this group, which was primarily more of a rock and roll rebel group. Had many, many hits, some of which I've already highlighted. But what I think was very good is that they brought a style which got back to that sort of rhythm and blues rock and roll style, which actually worked very, very well as a sort of antidote to the Beatles, who were very much more of the harmonious style that we all know and love. But the thing is that what happened was that the Rolling Stones, although they had a lot of great chart success in the 1960s and very early 70s, didn't actually earn a lot of money like a lot of bands who were successful in the 1960s. Some might say, as indeed they probably would have said, they were exploited and they didn't get the revenues that they should have done. Now, this is where I think that the Rolling Stones became clever from a business perspective, because as they recognized they needed to do something, they started to become very entrepreneurial. Here's one classic example. So we knew that they had lots of hits, and people within the group recognized they had a tremendous catalog. So what they did is they started to sell some of those songs to businesses. The famous one, of course, is the song "Start Me Up."
Yeah, with the Microsoft deal,
which was suddenly, yes, exactly, which was the fact that Microsoft, who was creating a commercial for Windows 95. Yes, Closure Pete, I know you're still running that version. However,
yeah,
the fact
I
of the
run it on
matter
my Mac. Yeah,
that the Microsoft paid the Rolling Stones over $3 million for that particular usage. Very clever.
Yes.
And some people at the time thought, my goodness, that's an extraordinary amount of money for the time that Bill Gates decided to do it. But listen, here's the thing. At the time, many people actually, ironically, didn't know what Microsoft did. So I know it seems strange today.
Yes, it's
but
strange
actually
today,
at the time when computers were not really very much of a consumer household goods or even in business, but was very clever because they used the association of the Rolling Stones, and the Rolling Stones gained from it, but it actually helped to launch them. Now, I think that, again, there was a big lesson. The other thing that the Rolling Stones did is they suddenly realized that music itself, selling records traditionally, wasn't going to give them a lot of money. But what they did do is they went on world tours. And the rock and roll event was about an arena, filling arenas and selling merchandise, selling seats. They earned tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars.
I can see how Mick Jagger, their frontman, with his rather camp antics,
Yes.
it would play well. It would play well on the big stage, is what I'm
quite.
Saying. Now, do you think that the rivalry with the Beatles was something that made them seem like this great rock and roll band? Because the Beatles were the popular one, promoted by it seems all the right people, and one that your mum would be happy with you following because they look reasonably neat, at least to start with, and the rock and roll crazy alternative with these guys with the funny camp bloke at the front.
Well, the bottom line is that, like,
so it made it risque and exciting.
They needed the risk. They needed an antidote. They needed something different, and the Rolling Stones provided something different. And I think that what was interesting as well, you mentioned about Mick Jagger, he was a very provocative frontman. So not many rock and roll bands had that type of style. Now it's become almost like a template today. I think that what's also interesting is that Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, wrote also for other people. Now, in similar ways that Lennon and McCartney did that, they also realized that they could actually spread their talent elsewhere. It wasn't just about the Rolling Stones. Now, as we know that many artists go on collaborations with other artists, but to me, the Rolling Stones, when the moment you say it, if you think about rock and roll, they epitomize that whole nomenclature. And that's why I think that it's not just about the longevity. I think that critically, that I still think, this is just my personal view, the early music was better than the later music. I think they perhaps didn't.
But here's a question then. Now, if it's not the Rolling Stones as the greatest rock and roll band of all time, well, who is it then?
Well,
is it ABBA? They're not exactly rock and
well,
roll.
you see, we talked about this in a recent podcast because many people would say, well, ABBA was more of a pop group as opposed to a rock and roll group.
Not really rock and roll.
No, because
so who's the greatest
most people define. Well, I still think this is my view. I think that if you take it purely on merit for the first 10 years, it's definitely the Rolling Stones.
Yes.
If you think about purely longevity of catalog, if I was to be somehow stranded on a desert island thinking I can only listen to one rock and roll group, I would listen to U2. I don't mean you.
U2.
Because that would be terrible. That would be torture.
The
group U2, the Irish band U2, who I still think, and still going along strong, but I still think rival the Rolling Stones. Now there you go, folks, because that
is a controversial claim. Now, because U2 have their critics as them being rather po-faced and bland.
Yes. Well, I wouldn't say that because I do think that, Bono, Perhaps even fronting the Rolling Stones could do a good job, because I mean, the bottom line is, I think that the catalogue, the quality of the music, and they have evolved. If you think of the early days to the latter days, they've evolved, they've moved. I don't think the rock and roll Rolling Stones have done the same.
So, I'm not going to give an opinion on this, but specifically because I'm not a fan of rock and roll or pop music, so I can't really put in an opinion. But I do notice that bands like in the 80s, Duran Duran, they were massively successful. Shouldn't they? Aren't they up there somewhere? Being the greatest? No.
Sorry to have to say. I'm sure we'll get lots of
letters. They sold lots of records, you know.
They did.
It's not just that. So the criteria are artistic quality as well as volume. Oh, right.
Yes. Well, I think if you think about a success of a band, it's clearly about an opinion. Of course it is, but I think it's about chart success, longevity, quality of music, artistic influence. Now, what I mean by that is, we know, and I know I'm sorry to have to default again to the Beatles, but the Beatles not only influence music, they influence fashion and business and so on. So you've got to think about it from that point of view. But I do have a conclusion on the Rolling Stones, which is my bit, really, which is perhaps provocative. But at the end of the day, we want people's opinions. So here it is. It's in the form of a poem, of course, and it's called Rocks to Stones to Bits of Grit. For those who dislike the Rolling Stones, who just hear sounds of moaning groans, with tongue-tied tunes and terrible tones, it's just an abuse of microphones. Through the decades came music clones, and lots of copycats and not well-knowns. Now rock's rebels fade away with drones, and all that's left are ancient bones.
Dear. That's a bit dark. That is. We'll close it there. I think that's all we've got to say. I mean, surprise there for Mark. U2, possibly the greatest band of all time, but great in their early years with the Rolling Stones. So what do you think? Let us know. Remember to leave a comment below or in the comments section if you're listening on Spreaker. But that'll be all from us on Mark and Pete Live for this week. See you next time.